Grand Rise humans. Welcome back to High Level Intentions. I am your host, Asaneti Onita Zavi, and I am grateful to have you joining me for another meaningful conversation. If you're returning from part one of our Intentions versus Expectations series, welcome back. And if this is your first time tuning in, I encourage you to pause this episode and go listen to part one first, because today's conversation builds upon the foundation we established there. In part one, we explored the difference between intentions and expectations. We discussed how intentions are rooted in purpose, values, standards, and conscious decision making. We talked about what it means to move intentionally rather than attempting to control outcomes. We asked ourselves, can I desire commitment without demanding commitment? We also explored expectations and how hidden contracts, assumptions, and unspoken agreements can create disappointment when reality doesn't match our desires. We examined the difference between organic connections and relationships built with clear direction and purpose. We discussed consistency and how consistency is more than frequency, it is reliability, integrity, and follow through. And finally, we reflected on the importance of choosing discernment over judgment, understanding over conflict, and growth over blame. But there was one question that continued to echo long after that conversation ended. What happens when our expectations are rooted in unresolved wounds, unmet needs, and past experiences? What happens when we're not responding to the person in front of us, but to a story we've been carrying for years? Because sometimes the greatest challenge isn't understanding another person, sometimes the greatest challenge is understanding ourselves. And that's exactly where we're going today. In this episode, we're going deeper. We're exploring the relationships between expectations, emotional triggers, healing, self awareness, and the stories we create when communication breaks down. Because if part one was about understanding the difference between intentions and expectations, part two is about understanding where those expectations come from. So settle in, grab your journals if you have one, take a deep breath, and let's continue the conversation. Because growth doesn't happen when we avoid difficult questions. Growth happens when we're willing to sit with them. Let's dive in. Humans. As we've explored intentions, expectations, relationship philosophies, and consistency, a broader theme begins to emerge. Relationships are not just about finding alignment with another person, they're also about understanding how we respond when alignment isn't there. And I think it's important to acknowledge something. Not every relationship ends because someone is a bad person. Not every connection fails because someone was toxic. Sometimes two people are simply misaligned. Sometimes they want different things. Sometimes they move at different paces. Sometimes they define commitment, consistency, and connection differently. And that's okay. But how we handle those moments of misalignment reveals a great deal about our emotional maturity. Because when we discover that someone isn't aligned with us, we have a choice. We can accept the information and move forward with respect, or we can allow disappointment, frustration, fear, and unmet expectations to shape our behavior. And this is where the conversation naturally shifts inward. Because some of the most important lessons in relationships aren't found in what other people do. They're found in how we respond when things don't unfold the way we hoped. This is where many of us encounter something we don't always like to talk about: the red flags we ignore, not necessarily the red flags in other people, but sometimes the red flags within ourselves. The behaviors that show up when we don't get the outcomes we hoped for. The ways we react when reality doesn't match our expectations. The ways our wounds sometimes speak louder than our wisdom. So, welcome to Red Flags We Ignore, segment 5. One of the greatest lessons I've learned is that red flags aren't always loud. Sometimes they are subtle. Sometimes they appear in the way we communicate, the way we listen, the way we handle disagreements, the way we respond when someone tells us something we don't want to hear. Because healthy relationships don't require two people to agree on everything. Healthy relationships require two people to communicate respectfully when they don't. And one of the first places this challenge tends to show up is in the stories we tell ourselves about other people's intentions. One red flag we often ignore is projection. Projection happens when we assume someone else's intentions based on our own fears, past experiences, or unmet needs. Instead of asking questions, we create stories. Instead of seeking understanding, we make assumptions. Instead of listening, we react. When projection goes unchecked, it often creates another problem: the urge to manage outcomes rather than understand people. Another red flag is when communication becomes control, when a desire becomes a demand, when a preference becomes pressure, when understanding is replaced by convincing. Healthy communication seeks clarity, control seeks compliance, and those are not the same thing. When communication becomes focused on changing someone else's response, it also becomes easier to view differences as personal threats rather than natural realities. Another red flag is taking differences personally. Not every disagreement is rejection. Not every incompatibility is an insult. Not every misalignment is a reflection of your worth. Sometimes two people simply want different things, and the healthiest response isn't convincing someone to change, it's accepting the information they've given you. One of the clearest signs of emotional maturity is being able to hear, "This isn't right for me," without turning it into, "There must be something wrong with me." Because there is a difference. And when we struggle to accept that difference, conversations can quickly shift away from understanding altogether. Perhaps one of the biggest red flags we ignore is when communication shifts from understanding to winning. When the goal is no longer connection, when the goal is no longer clarity, when the goal becomes proving a point, defending an ego, being right, or making someone else wrong. At that point, the conversation is no longer about building, it's about battling. And healthy relationships cannot grow where understanding is absent. The truth is, relationships will always reveal something. They reveal our values, they reveal our expectations, they reveal our fears, and they reveal our communication patterns. And sometimes they reveal wounds that still needs healing. But if we're willing to pay attention, every interaction becomes an opportunity for growth, an opportunity to learn more about ourselves, an opportunity to refine our standards, and opportunity to become more emotionally mature. So instead of asking, "What did they do wrong?" perhaps we should also ask, "What did this experience reveal about me?" What beliefs surfaced? What expectations surfaced? What fears surfaced? And last but not least, what lessons surfaced? Because every connection, whether it lasts a season or a lifetime, leaves us with information. And when we choose growth over blame, we walk away wiser than we were before. Not bitter, not resentful, but better informed about what we're intentionally building moving forward. Humans, humans, humans. As we've explored intentions, expectations, relationship philosophies, consistency, and the red flags we often overlook, I think we've arrived at the most important part of this conversation, the part that isn't about them, the part that isn't about who's right or who's wrong, the part that isn't about winning an argument or proving a point, the part that's about growth. Because every experience in our lives, especially our relationships, leaves us with something, a lesson, a mirror, an opportunity, a deeper understanding of ourselves. And that's exactly what this experience became for me, baby. So, we're going to jump into what this experience taught me as Saneti. Because in part one, I told you that this podcast came along because of my own personal experience with dating in the modern day world now. You know what I mean? So, as I reflect on this experience, I realized something. One of the greatest gifts we can give ourselves is the ability to respond respectfully, even when we disagree. Not because we are weak, not because we are avoiding difficult conversations, but because respect is a reflection of our character, not someone else's behavior. Anyone can communicate respectfully when things are going their way. The true test is whether we can remain respectful when someone sees things differently than we do, when someone doesn't choose us, when someone doesn't agree with us, when someone wants something different than we want. And while I am still learning, one thing I know for certain is this: conflict is not always the highest form of communication. Sometimes understanding is. There were moments in this experience where I could have focused on defending my position, explaining myself repeatedly, trying to convince someone to see things from my perspective, trying to prove that my approach made sense. But I found myself asking a different question. What if understanding is more valuable than agreement? What if I don't need someone to agree with me in order to understand them? And what if they don't need to agree with me in order for them to understand them? Because understanding creates peace, even when alignment doesn't exist, even when the connection doesn't continue, even when two people ultimately choose different paths. Understanding allows us to walk away with clarity instead of carrying resentment. And perhaps that was one of the biggest lessons this experience taught me. Not every difference needs to become a conflict. Sometimes a difference is simply information. Information that helps us determine whether we're aligned. Information that helps us understand another person's needs. Information that helps us make healthier decisions moving forward. And as I sat with everything that happened, I also learned something about myself. I learned that I value intentionality. I value communication. I value patience. I value understanding. I value allowing people the space to be who they are instead of trying to convince them to become who I need them to be for me. I learned that I am no longer interested in forcing outcomes. I am interested in alignment. I learned that I can communicate my desires without demanding that someone fulfills them. I learned that I can respect someone's truth, even when it's different from my own. And perhaps most importantly, I learned that difference between discernment and judgment, because those two things are often confused. Judgment says you're wrong. Discernment says you're different. Judgment says you should change. Discernment says I don't think we're aligned. Judgment seeks to criticize. Discernment seeks to understand. Judgment attacks character. Discernment evaluates compatibility. And the more I mature, the more I realize that discernment is not about deciding who is better. It's about deciding what is healthy, aligned, and appropriate for my life. Discernment allows us to acknowledge differences without condemning people. It allows us to honor our standards without devaluing someone else's choices. It allows us to walk away from misalignment without carrying bitterness. And that, to me, is growth. Not getting everything we want, not always finding the perfect relationship, not always being understood, but being able to leave an experience with wisdom instead of wounds, with clarity instead of confusion, with gratitude instead of resentment. So, if there is one thing I hope you take away from today's conversation, it is this: not every connection is meant to become a commitment, not every disagreement is a rejection, not every misalignment is a failure. Sometimes people simply reveal what they value, how they move, and what they need. And when we listen carefully, we gain the information necessary to decide whether we are truly aligned, not through judgment, but through discernment. And that may be one of the most loving things we can do for ourselves and for others. As we bring today's conversation to a close, I want to leave you with this thought. Life has a way of teaching us through our relationships, through the people who stay, through the people who leave, through the people who challenges us, and through the people who helped us see ourselves more clearly. Every connection offers an opportunity to understand ourselves better, to refine our values, to strengthen our boundaries, to communicate more honestly, and to become more intentional about what we are cultivating in our lives. Today's conversation wasn't really about dating. It wasn't really about relationships. It wasn't really about one experience. It was about alignment. It was about understanding the difference between intentions and expectations. It was about learning how to communicate our desires without controlling outcomes. It was about recognizing the difference between discernment and judgment. And perhaps most importantly, it was about understanding that not everyone who enters our lives is meant to travel the entire journey with us. Some people arrive to teach, some arrive to challenge, some arrive to affirm, and some arrive simply to reveal what we truly value. So, before we part ways today, I'd like to leave you with a few questions to reflect upon. Take them into your journal. Take them into your meditation practice. Take them into your conversations. And most importantly, take them into your heart. Ask yourself this: am I moving through life with intentions or expectations? Have I clearly communicated my desires, values, and standards? Am I expecting someone to become who I need them to be? Or am I accepting them for who they are today? Do I genuinely prefer organic connections? Or do I need clarity and direction? How do I define consistency? And have I communicated that definition? Am I asking whether someone likes me? Or am I asking whether our values are truly compatible? When misalignment appears, do I respond with judgment? Or do I respond with discernment? And perhaps the most important question of all: what am I intentionally building in this season of my life? Take some time to sit with those questions. You may be surprised by what they reveal. Humans, thank you for sharing this space with me today. Thank you for your time, your energy, your presence, and your willingness to grow. My hope is that today's conversation inspired you to become a little more intentional, a little more self aware, and a little more compassionate with yourself and others. Remember, growth is not about perfection, it's about awareness, it's about learning. It's about choosing alignment over attachment and understanding over assumptions. As always, I encourage you to continue doing the inner work, continue asking the difficult questions, continue seeking wisdom, and continue becoming the highest version of yourself. This is Asaneti Onita Zavi, and you've been listening to High Level Intentions. Until next time, may your intentions remain high, your heart remain open, and your spirit remain grounded. I appreciate you and every one of you. Keep growing, keep healing, keep evolving, and most importantly, keep seeking what is missing. Ashe, Ashe, away.